Alright, so now let's finally go in and let's set up the render for our dust here. So I'm just going to put everything on a layer that we're going to want here. So I'm going to grab our guy here and let's grab our fluid. Let's grab our Skydome light and our AI sky and also our floor here. And let's just see what's actually going to be in camera here. If we go down towards the end of our sequence, okay, so we're not going to need any more of the building itself for our holdouts, so this should be all right. Let's just make sure we have our ground and this bit of concrete here, and let's add this in. Let's call this dust. So now what I'm going to do is we're going to set up RGB lights here, and essentially, so we can relight this in comp, we're going to create 3 different lights, one in each color, and then we can draw out that information really easily in our compositing package. So if we just get started, let's go create a directional light. And let's bring that over here. This is going to be our key light, so I'm going to match this to the angle of the sun, which, if we take a look here, is kind of on a 90 degrees and just a little bit back here. So it's almost overhead. So, all right, let's just kind of mimic that, maybe a bit to the right. So this is going to be our key light, and let's just give it an Arnold exposure of, let's say, 3 for now. And we can bump this up as we see fit. And let's make the color to say blue. So now let's duplicate this. And we're going to use a fill light to fill in the rest of the information. Let's have this green. And maybe let's fill it in from the back angle here. We're kind of overhead, so it doesn't really matter so much, as long as we fill in the rest of the angle here. And let's duplicate this one more time, and let's put it around the other direction. And let's make sure to change that color to red. Okay, so now let's go into our render settings, and let's just go in and reduce the camera AA samples down to 3 and reduce the glossy and refraction. We can just put this down to 1. And for this, we're not going to use indirect lighting. So let's turn down the refraction as well. And that's it. So to test, I'm going to turn off the motion blur as well. And now let's go into our AOVs and delete all these. Now, if we go into our built-in AOV groups, we've got all of our volume passes here, which are really useful. So we got direct, indirect, opacity, and volume. And we're going to use this to separate it off of our ground, because we're going to need to cast shadows on the ground. And so we're going to have to render the ground for that. But then we can separate it with our volume pass. So let's grab the volume and direct and opacity. And now let's go ahead into our Arnold render view and take a render. So now you can see we have our dust, and if we start shuffling through the red, green, and blue channels, we've got all our information in there. And that's going to be really useful, as well as we've got our volume pass, which will separate it out from the geometry, and then the direct lighting and the opacity pass. So all right. Now let's just go in and let's select our ground here, and we're going to uncheck the matte on our AI standard here, because we're going to have to catch the shadows here. So now if we render, it's going to be quite bright. So let's just turn down the color, so something a bit darker. And let's add in one more pass here. Let's go into our AOVs, and under built-in, let's add a shadow matte pass. So now if we render this and look at our shadow matte, You can see we've got all the shadows, but we've still got all this RGB light. But we can just use one of either the blue, green, or red channels to grab this. In this case, we're going to grab the blue channel off the ground, and we're going to use the volume to separate out just the areas that we want to grab the shadows from. So now with all these passes available, let's go back into our beauty here and let's select our dust. And if we want, we can just go in and tweak the render settings a little bit. So maybe under the shading, maybe I'll make it a little bit lighter, and maybe I'll make the color to be just a little bit darker. Maybe I'll bring it back to where it was before. So I'm liking the way this is looking here. So that's pretty much it. So now we have our smoke lit with RGB lighting, and we've got all the information in the red, green, and blue channel. Plus we've got a few render layers so we can separate out the shadows and the volume itself. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back and I'm going to turn on our motion blur again. And I'm going to increase the AA samples to 4. And let's see where we start here. We don't need to render the entire thing. I think we have our fluids starting at 79. So I'm going to now kick off this render starting from 79.